This is lesson 14.2 on natural selection, GCSE AQA. So scientists explain the variety of life today as the result of a process called natural selection, and this idea was suggested by this chap here, Charles Darwin, about 150 years ago. It's based on the idea that animals and plants are always in competition with each other, and sometimes an animal or a plant gains an advantage in that competition. And this might be against another species, or it might be against members of its own species. Well, that individual is more likely to survive, it's more likely to breed and pass on those characteristics, and this is known as natural selection. So Charles Darwin was the first person to describe this process, and he described it as survival of the fittest. He said that reproduction is a very wasteful process, and animals and plants always produce more offspring than their environment can actually support. You can see that here with these kittens. So the idea is that in any population there is variation, and the organisms with the characteristics best suited to their environment are the ones that are going to feed more, they're going to survive more, they're going to breed more, and they're going to pass on that beneficial characteristic to the next generation. And that is all the idea of survival of the fittest. So if we think about rabbits, the rabbit with the best all-round eyesight and the sharpest hearing and longest legs will be the ones that are most likely to escape being eaten by a fox or a vulture. They will be the ones most likely to live long enough to breed. What's more, they'll pass on those useful alleles onto their babies, whereas the slower, less alert rabbits will get eaten, and their alleles are less likely to be passed on. So what is the part played by mutation? Well, new forms of alleles result from changes in existing genes. These changes are known as mutations, and they are tiny changes perhaps in the base sequence of the long strands of DNA. Now, mutations occur quite naturally through mistakes made in copying the DNA when the cells divide. And what they do is they introduce variety into the genes of a species in terms of survival. And that is actually really important. Many mutations have no effect on the characteristics of an organism, and some mutations are actually harmful. However, just occasionally a mutation has a good effect. Produces an adaptation that makes an organism better suited to its environment. This makes it more likely that the organism will survive, breed, and pass its genes on to the future generation. So whatever the adaptation, if it helps an organism to survive and reproduce, it will get passed on to the next generation. And the mutant gene will gradually become more common in the population, and it will cause the species to evolve. If we look at this little chap, his mutation has resulted in him not having the correct gene for his coat colour. He's going to be seen by his prey, and he's less likely to survive as he won't be able to feed. This chap is going to be seen by his predators much more easily. He's going to be predated upon, and that will mean that he doesn't get to survive, breed, and pass on his genes to the next generation. And so the prevalence of that colour of hedgehog won't be seen naturally in the wild. Whereas if you go to the snow-capped mountains of somewhere cold, then what you're going to see is organisms that where the white coat colour has given an advantage. If you are an animal that preys on others, you are better camouflaged if you have that mutation. And so that coat colour will prevail in the next generation because it's not only giving you an advantage, it's enabled you to survive by feeding more, and therefore you're likely to survive and pass on that allele. Your next generation will also benefit, and of the offspring in that next generation, those that also have that beneficial allele will go on to pass it on, and so on. And this whole process is natural selection. So in Malpeque Bay in Canada has some of the largest oyster beds in the world. But in 1915, the fishermen noticed something was wrong. The oysters were under threat from a new disease. By 1922, the oyster beds were almost completely empty. The oysters had been wiped out by a destructive new disease. Fortunately, a few of the oysters had a mutation, which made them resistant to the disease, and these were the only ones to survive and breed. The oyster beds filled up again, and by 1940 they were producing more oysters than ever. A new population of oysters had in effect evolved, and this had been as a result of natural selection. Now, almost every oyster in Malpeque Bay now carries a gene that makes them resistant to that disease. So the disease is no longer a problem. So let's just summarise what we've said today. We've said that a mutation is a change in the genetic material, the DNA, which results in the new form of a gene. We've said that natural selection works by selecting the organisms best adapted to a particular habitat. We've said that different organisms in a species show a wide range of variation because of differences in their genes. And we've said that the individuals with the characteristics most suited to their environment are most likely to survive and breed successfully. And that the genes that have produced these successful characteristics are then passed on to the next generation.